Next up, I want to introduce Janet Stickmon to the stage. Welcome, Janet.
Thank you. Thank you, Arlene. Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you, Candy. I'll begin by saying that I proudly identify as Blackapina. I am a biracial woman of African American and Filipino American ancestry. My parents were pen pals. My mother was from Cebu and my father was from Shreveport, Louisiana. They started writing sometime in the 1960s, and in the course of their exchange, my father told my mother that he had many pen pals. And when they found out that he was Black, they stopped writing. And my mother couldn't understand that. She was heartbroken by the idea. And my mother became the one woman who kept on writing. She did not stop writing. And a few years later, my father goes to the Philippines, asks permission of my Lola and my Lolo to marry their youngest daughter. They said yes, and my mom said yes, and she was brought to the United States on a marriage visa. A few years later, I was born. And I share this story because I think it's so very important that my mother said yes to continuing to write to my father, that I think this serves as a really good example of what it means to begin to be in solidarity with Black people, to remain in contact, to have a desire to understand. As Allison had mentioned earlier, the necessity of empathy. I think that this is the first stage. And in this desire to be empathetic and being moved by the experiences of Black people, this includes, on one hand, most certainly recognizing and the systemic injustices that Black people have been subjected to over the centuries, while at the same time understanding and studying the numerous accomplishments, both individual and collective innovations, contributions, triumphs that have shaped our nation over the centuries. I think holding those two in balance is so very important if we're talking about Filipino solidarity with Black lives. Of course, I think this is part of the equation. It is most certainly crucial to take a look at the massive overhaul that is needed when it comes to law enforcement and the criminal justice system. And I share in some of the doubt that Khalil Gibran Muhammad mentions in some of his work, talking about being unsure that that law enforcement can change itself, given how many centuries of systemic abuse it has failed to change. In any case, when looking at some of the interpersonal efforts that I mentioned earlier, I think that this is a part of, but a very crucial part of the equation when it comes to creating solidarity. I think it's also important to make sure that we, as Filipinos, dive deep into our history, our pre-colonial history, our indigenous roots, knowing that we trace our roots to the Itas and the Agtas, and being proud of that, not being ashamed of the dark skin, the coarse hair. And having said that, making sure that we affirm that beauty of Blackness and darkness and coarseness of one's hair when it comes to the Filipinos here that are in our personal lives in the here and now. Whether we are a part Black ancestry or not, that we affirm the dark skin, the coarse hair, the Blackness that has so often been associated with ugliness, dirtiness, criminality, undesirability, all of these different things that when we look at, for instance, in my case, my mother looking at me and seeing the beauty of my multiplicity, I'll never forget I came home from school one day, and this was in the second grade, and one of the kids had called another Black student in the class the N-word. And I came home and I told my mom, look, mama, I'm white. Look at the palm of my hand. And my mom was hot. She turned my hand over and said, no, you are Black, you are Filipino. And this is what I mean by affirmation, the ways in which we can combat the very racism that our Blackapina, O's, X's, children experience in education, amongst many other arenas. How do we combat that? And this is one example of how that can begin to happen. I think something else that's important to note is, I'll share again my mother, when it came to self-love, instilling self-love in our children, and how she had taken my hands and ran my fingers through my hair to feel the waves and the naps. This, my Cebuano mother understanding the necessity of making sure her child experience this self-love. On many occasions, I've talked about how, being Black, I've had to seek out my history, seek out a way of articulating what I'm experiencing, whether it is the various injustices or the various joys and beauties. And I had to do this because my survival and my sanity depended on it. And this is something that I must ask Filipinos to do, to understand that, in this effort to maintain, to strive toward, to maintain solidarity with African Americans, is that you have to behave as though your survival and your sanity depends on it. That is what can make it deep. That's what can make it transformative. And I think that is something that is entirely necessary. Something else I would like to add is, when it comes to, again, me being amongst many Blackapinas, O's, X's, or those who identify as Afro-Pinay or Pinoy, it is important to make sure that we embrace those who are multiracial of African-American and Filipino-American heritage. Embrace us as part of the family, because we are. It is important to understand our beauty and how we straddle these two beautiful, rich cultures, and that there is a particular answer that resides in living in that in-between space. That in-between space is sacred. That in-between space is one that is unique. It represents, in my case, it represents the path, the intersection of two paths, and the fact that I'm not a living contradiction, as much as people might ask, well, which one do I identify with more? Am I more Black than Filipino? Am I more Filipino than Black? No, I'm both. When I say we being a Filipino. When I say we, I also mean being Black. I am both, and I am everything in between and everything beyond. And I think it is so crucial to make sure that we recognize that and value all the folks that have accepted us for all that we are. My last point is talking about my daughter. My daughter is 12 years old, and she is Black and Filipino, but she is also Puerto Rican and Jamaican. In my latest book, To Black Parents Visiting Earth, I dedicate a chapter in there to one of her teachers, Christina Alejo, affectionately known as Tita Tina. Once a week, I have her take classes, Tagalog classes with Tita Tina via FaceTime. And her experience with Tita Tina has been an incredible model of what it means to embrace a child wholly and completely. And if I may backtrack for a moment, for those who may not know who Tita Tina is, she's been an educator in the San Francisco Unified School District for over 20 years, and is also one of the co-founders of Galing Bata After School Program. And what I have observed is the way in which she can seamlessly instill in my child the way in which she comes from a legacy of freedom fighters on both sides. And there is this constant reminder that no matter what anyone tells her, when it comes to the multiplicity of who she is, being Black, being Filipino, being Puerto Rican and Jamaican, as much as people might say she's some diluted version of any of those things, when it comes to Filipino culture, Tita Tina has reminded her that this culture belongs to her, and no one can take it away from her. And so it's that wholehearted embrace that I think is so important for us, biracial, multiracial people of Black and Filipino heritage, to feel and to know that it's there, that it's genuine, and that it's enduring. Thank you.